is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. In those days, a decree went out from the Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and the family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged, and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in bands and cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated.
So I'm going to start this morning with a little recap to catch us back up to date in case you've forgotten how far we've traveled on our journey to Bethlehem these last few weeks. So we began our Advent journey 3 Sundays ago. And the first week we looked deeper into Mary's story and the announcement by the angel Gabriel that she was to have a son, not just any son, but the Son of God. And we talked about what was probably going on during that time that Mary visited her cousin Elizabeth, and what that might have been like. And we talked about how it's possible that Joseph came there because it was closer to where he lived in Bethlehem to hear and to learn of this pregnancy. And then we tried to imagine how Joseph must have felt. We talked about that Scripture tells us he was an honorable man, and that when he heard the news about Mary's pregnancy, that he thought it best to release her from the engagement because he was concerned about her life. We know that Joseph went back to his home and no doubt struggled with what he should do, but we know that he was visited in a dream by a holy messenger who told him that it was okay, that he should take Mary as his wife. So it's possible that when Joseph awoke that next day that he went back to Ein where Mary was staying with her cousin Elizabeth and told Mary what had happened, and they began plans for their wedding. I don't know what happened after that, but I would imagine somehow Joseph had to tell his family what was going on, that they were going to speed up the wedding date, that he was going to travel to Nazareth, and that they would go to Mary's hometown there for the wedding. You have to wonder how it was that Joseph explained all this to his parents. I don't know if you were Joseph's parents, if you might believe the story that he had to tell, or if he just tried to gloss over it and just say the basics, you know, Mary's pregnant, and have them think whatever they wanted to think. So we know that Joseph and Mary made that 9 or 10-day journey back to Nazareth, where their wedding was hastily planned and they were soon married. Now you have to remember too that it probably would have been hard to hide the pregnancy, because at this point Mary probably would have been about 5 months pregnant. And so it's likely at the wedding that the guests and neighbors and people of Nazareth, remember it's a really small town, would have suspected, if they couldn't tell outright, that Mary was pregnant. So we have to wonder again, how did they explain this? How did they bother to tell the people of Nazareth, Mary's friends and relatives, what had happened? I can imagine if they tried to, that they probably wouldn't have been believed. So maybe they decided just to keep all the details to themselves. Now, in the first century, when a couple would get married, they typically would move into the husband's parents' home, and there they would live until the husband could add on or build a place of their own, and that would then be where they would live. It would have been expected that Mary and Joseph should have taken up residence in Bethlehem, because that's Joseph's hometown after the wedding ceremony. But we know from Luke's gospel that they remained in Nazareth after the wedding, and we can only suppose that maybe that was because of Mary's pregnancy and she wanted to be near her family. We also know that, again, it's a 10-day journey at least from Bethlehem, from Nazareth down to where Bethlehem is. And you can imagine being 5 months pregnant that it would have put a great deal of strain on Mary to have to make that journey at that time. And so perhaps they decided to stay in Mary's hometown rather than making that trip. And the other thing is that they did have midwives and women who helped with delivering babies at that time, and so perhaps Mary knew someone in her hometown that would be able to help her with that, and so it just made sense for them to stay in Nazareth rather than return to Joseph's home. So you can imagine that they settled into married life, however that looked, and they spent their final months of Mary's pregnancy there. Maybe Joseph was able to find work. Remember, he's a carpenter, and though the small town of Nazareth might not have been a good place to work, remember about an hour away is Sepphoris, where booming city, where maybe he was able to travel and find work to sustain his family. So in the 9th month of Mary's pregnancy, we guess, Roman soldiers arrived in Nazareth and told all the people that the emperor had he had commanded that a census would be taken, and that every family must return to their hometown, which would have been for married couples to the husband's hometown, to be counted. And this census was for the purpose of levying taxes. And so the Romans wanted everyone to go back to their hometown because that's where the husband's family was, and that's, if they owned property, that's where their property would have been. And it's likely that Joseph was part owner or had certainly an inheritance or something from his father, and that would have been in Bethlehem, so that was why they needed to go to Bethlehem. As a wife, now, Mary did not have a choice. She could not stay home. She had to go with him on this journey to be counted by the Romans for this census for the levying of taxes. So this tells us a lot about what's going on in that area at the time. We know that these communities were under Roman rule, that they didn't have a say-so, and whether or not they would travel to be counted and taxed. And so it didn't matter that Mary's pregnancy was far enough along that probably travel wasn't a wise thing to do. But they, I imagine, were fearful that if they did not do this that they had been commanded by the emperor to do, that their lives would be in danger. And so they had to make that journey. Now, if you were Mary, you might be feeling a little bit apprehensive, maybe would be a good word. I don't think Mary probably knew anybody in Bethlehem. It's not where she grew up. It's not where she was from. And so maybe the people that would help her with the birth would not be known to her, and so maybe she would be comfortable and maybe even anxious about being away from home when it came time for her to deliver her baby. The problem is that the Gospels don't tell us anything about how Mary felt. They tell us nothing, really. And so we're left to our own imaginations and try to put ourselves into Mary's sandals and imagine what she might have felt. You have to ask yourselves, what is a young woman who's probably 9 months pregnant by now, a jumble of hormones, what is she going to feel when she hears that what she thought she could control, which is where she would have her child, is now being stripped away from her because of the emperor's edict that they have to return to Joseph's hometown? I can imagine that Mary was probably disappointed, but we have to remember that this disappointment turns into the story that we share every year at Christmas about how Jesus came to be born in Bethlehem. And so it's an important part of our story. And because of the edict of this Roman emperor, the story of Jesus' birth unfolds in an entirely different way than if that hadn't happened. And so there's a deeper meaning to this story about Mary and Joseph and this baby born of God. God, I think, was taking this decision by this greedy emperor to tax the folks and make them return to their homes to be counted as a way of serving God's purposes. And I think this is what we can learn from this. Now, the Gospel of Luke doesn't mention the presence of a donkey. I know, it's disappointing. But you have to think that, gentlemen, you're not going to be able to relate to this as well, but ladies, if you were 9 months pregnant and you had to walk for 10 days, I don't know that you'd be happy about that. I'm not sure riding a donkey would have been any better. But that's what happened. So we put donkey in there, and it makes a nice story. And we hope that something was done to accommodate Mary's journey. We would hope that to be true. So a donkey's as good a place as any to start. So after traveling again for these long days, 9 or 10 days, we can only imagine the relief they must have felt when they finally reached the city of Jerusalem, because they knew it would only be a few more hours' walk to get to Bethlehem. And so perhaps 10 or 11 days later, they arrive in Joseph's hometown of Bethlehem. And our gospel story tells us that while they were there, it came time for Mary to deliver her child. Now, we don't know if Mary had gone into labor before she got to Bethlehem, or if it happened that they got to Bethlehem and some time passed before the baby came. We're not sure the time sequence there because, again, we're not given any facts. But it seems as if when Mary and Joseph arrive in Bethlehem that they've not made any prior arrangements for accommodations. And as you might imagine, if everyone has to go to their hometown, there was probably a whole lot of people back in Bethlehem at that time, because they also needed to be counted. And the story we have in our scripture tells us that they hunted for a place, they went to an inn. The innkeeper says there isn't any room, but you can use the stable. And that is the story that we have in our scripture. And that's the story we've all grown up with. But we have to remember that sometimes interpretation gives us a little better or a little different idea of how the story happened that maybe we need to look at. And one of the debates that is had between biblical scholars is whether or not Mary and Joseph actually could not find any room in an inn, or even if there was an inn at all. So the question first, though, that we need to ask is this: if Joseph was from Bethlehem, then why would he and Mary have needed to stay in an inn? Why couldn't they just stay with Joseph's family? Did you ever think about that? It's a great question. And I think it can give us maybe a new perspective on this story. So the Greek word that is translated in most versions of Luke's gospel into the word in, I-N-N, is kataluma. And the only other time that this particular word appears in the Gospels is when Jesus sends his disciples to find a room that they can use for the Last Supper together. And that room, as you recall, is described as a room above a house, right? The upper room. So maybe a more accurate translation of this kataluma is guest room rather than inn. And it might be helpful for us to talk about what first century homes looked like at that time. We just need to remember that they have archaeological remains of these homes, and so they know that there would have been a central room that served as a kitchen and living area. And off of that room would have been sleeping quarters where the parents would likely have slept. And typically there would be another room called a guest room where the children would sleep, unless there were guests in the home. And in that case, the guests would be given the guest room or the kids' room, and the kids would then move in and sleep with their parents. This guest room was the kataluma. And there is where it's likely that Mary and Joseph would have stayed. Now remember also in these small homes in this area, there was a pen or a stable area where the family would have kept their animals, cow for milk, chickens, sheep, whatever. And it would have either been behind the home, or if the homes had been built in a cave, we know that they sometimes built the cow's pen and down underneath the home. So this was in order to keep, of course, the animals safe. And so if Joseph's family was a humble family with modest income, It's likely that they would have had just one of these guest rooms, and this guest room would have been for, of course, people who came to visit the family. They could have put beds down along the floor, and they speculate that these rooms could have held up to 6 people. Again, we don't know this for sure, but that seems to be from what evidence we have. Now, we don't know how many people were in Joseph's family, if he had brothers or sisters, but let's say that he had some. And if each of them were required to return to their homes, to Bethlehem, to be counted, it's possible that the family home, or the home of Joseph's parents, could easily have been full, and that there would not have been any room for them in the kataluma, in the guest room. And so that might have been how there was no room in the end came about. And another reason that Mary and Joseph would have been set up in the stable is because of the purity laws of the Jewish faith. If you look in Leviticus, in chapter 12, verse 7, we're told that when a woman gives birth to a son, she becomes unclean until her child is circumcised on the 8th day after he's born. And so then it seems likely that Joseph's parents could have set up a birthing room in the barn or in the stable area of the family home, not only to give Joseph and Mary privacy, but to keep everything and everyone else in the house from becoming ritually unclean. And so for this humble family that had limited resources and only a single guest room or kataluma, the stable would have been the best option that they could have offered. And it was as clean as it could be, and probably was just as good a place to sleep as on the floor in the house with the rest of the folks. So we have to ask ourselves after this, what was Mary thinking as she was going through those pains of labor? Was she missing her mother? Was she saying to herself, this is not how it was supposed to be? And I can bet that it wasn't a silent night. Our Christmas carols sometimes miss the reality of what Mary was experiencing during birth that night. And we sing that song, all is calm, all is bright. But you know, the reality of the Messiah's birth came in the midst of messiness and disappointment and pain, like all other births. So he was born among the animals, with a feeding trough for his first bed. A very humble beginning, but certainly one that continues to tell us about God's plan for us and for the world. And God uses the most humble of circumstances to bring about change in the world. But you have to imagine that Mary and Joseph's dreams had been dashed, that this isn't at all what they had planned for their lives. But we also need to remember that God was at work redeeming the world, because that's how God works. God uses every circumstance, including the oppression of a Roman emperor, to serve God's purposes. So that journey to Bethlehem, pregnant as she was not a journey that Mary wanted to take. And it wasn't what she imagined might happen in her life. But we have to also remember that this wasn't the last unwanted journey that Mary would take. Remember, it wasn't but a few years that Mary would have to take a journey to Egypt to save 3-year-old Jesus' life. And then Mary would make another journey that she probably didn't want to make 33 years down the road, when she would take her son and watch him walk down the Via Dolorosa as she followed him to the cross. We also take a lot of unwanted journeys in our lives. Think of those that have been laid off from work, those that are battling cancer or some other health issue, a family whose child is struggling with drug addiction, or families that are torn apart by divorce, or parents who have simply lost their way and can't hold it together for their kids. You see, life has a lot of these moments. A lot of journeys get taken that people don't want to take. But you see, the good news of the scripture is that God not only walks along with us on his journeys, but God redeems them and brings good from them. Because the Bible is full of such stories. Stories of journeys that probably folks wish they hadn't had to take. Joseph sold into slavery by his brothers. Not a journey Joseph would have chosen. David fled into the wilderness when King Saul tried to kill him. There is where he stayed and wrote the Psalms and asked God, why are you doing this and why aren't you saving me? But you see, that wasn't a journey David wanted to take, and it wasn't the end of David's story. So the child that was born in a stable in Bethlehem would walk to Calvary. But that would not be the end of his story. All of us take unwanted journeys. But God always walks with us on these journeys. And God works through them and redeems them. And these difficult journeys in our lives will never be the end of our story. Now, in hindsight, we can see what Mary couldn't see. When she entered that stable and her contractions began and got closer and closer together, she wasn't there to hear the angels singing to the shepherds. She didn't know the Magi were already on their way bringing gifts to pay homage to the little king. And she certainly couldn't see that we would be reading this story thousands of years later, trying to reflect upon its meaning for us in our lives. But I invite you, regardless of the journey that you are on, whether it's a journey you want to take or not, to trust, to have faith, and to know that the journeys of our lives will never be the end of our story. And we can know this because it's just that kind of faith and hope and trust that kept Mary going on that long and difficult journey to Bethlehem that very first Christmas.